Back in the 90s, a few years before my son was born, I read Backlash by Susan Faludi. Anybody remember that book? A few people. I hear a little yeah back there. That's good. Faludi is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and Backlash had won the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction. In it, Faludi debunked media representations of women in the 80s. The women's movement of the 70s had won some gains, but now, throughout the media, there were headlines suggesting that these gains had not made women happier. The media told stories of female burnout and mental illness. They painted a picture of empowered women discovering a man shortage and then infertility. If a working woman found a way to have children, then based on the accounts in the media, it seemed likely she would soon discover the tragedy of toxic daycare. The news stories were not backed up by statistics and did not show any actual trends, but these themes were repeated so frequently that it began to look like increased equality was causing an epidemic of unhappiness. And that story soon became a larger shared narrative in the country. Meanwhile, Faludi said the fashion industry was promoting frilly baby doll dresses for grown women, and TV shows about ambitious or tough women like the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Cagney and Lacey were replaced by shows like 30-something, where a saintly stay-at-home mom is envied by her friends who have careers. Faludi said it was all an attempt to recoup and reinforce a more male-dominated society. She pointed to President Reagan, who in that same time span rolled back some of the gains that women had won. It was a backlash, she said, to protect male privilege. Backlash made a big impression on me. I was about 18 when I read it, and it was the first feminist book I had ever read. A few years later, in 1999, when I held my son for the first time, all tiny and precious, a radical thought occurred to me. It went like this: my God, men come from women. It felt like an incredibly subversive thought, right? And yet here was the evidence and the object of my absolute adoration, a just-born person who was a future man. I felt in that moment that nothing could have made me love and care for men more than holding that tiny new one right there in my arms. And not long after, I discovered Claire Bateman's beautiful poem called Childhood of a Stranger. I'm going to read it to you. She writes, "You too once were carried in your sleep. You to someone a warm weight of breath and cloth, wisps of sleep like slow steam off your seamless face, day distilling into dreams in a skull yet soft. Now we are encrusted with barbed years, flinty, adamantine, ready to repel all assaults against our independence. But for that hint of honey, trace of down, that secret nerve that never has grown numb, there is a debt between us even now that our autonomy cannot remove, a bent towards something more than tolerance, older than kindness, oddly akin to love." I felt so connected to other humans, and yet nothing in my Western upbringing had prepared me for this. A few weeks after my son's birth, on Mother's Day, my husband gave me some flowers and a card and a cute new pair of sweatpants from the Gap. And I burst into tears. I did not want to need stretchy pants. I felt frumpy and unattractive, and unfeminine? WTF, right? Like, what the fractured mindset, okay? With all of us interconnected in such tender ways, how did the predominant culture we live in end up so intractably hierarchical, so hard to change, not only in terms of gender, but also race and other features? And how on earth did it come to pass that a body that has just brought new life into the world is considered by anyone to be anything less than amazing? In the history of what we call the Western world, there are clues that it may not always have been this way. But it can take a little sleuthing to find them and figure out where they lead. I titled this sermon after a scholarly journal by the same name, The Case of the Missing Goddess. In it, Catherine Rowntree, a professor of anthropology at Massey University in New Zealand, tells of her visit to the National Museum of Archaeology on the island of Malta. Malta is located between Sicily and the North African coast, right in the Mediterranean. The museum contained display cases filled with the kinds of objects for which Malta is famous. A huge collection of ancient figurines from the Neolithic era, which began about 10,000 years ago. Two obviously female figurines known as the Sleeping Lady and the Venus of Malta have become quite iconic. And there are many other female figurines too, and then there are some that are slightly ambiguous, but they're highly stylized with very full, rounded hips, thighs, calves, and upper arms, and a relatively small fold across the chest. Some stand, others sit. Either they wear skirts or their legs are positioned discreetly, unlike the more obvious figurines in the collection. Locals in Malta refer to them as goddesses and fertility goddesses. But inside the museum, Rowntree noticed, archaeologists had used the word fertility only once in the descriptions on the display cases, and that was actually for a solitary case of objects entitled phallic symbols. Although the objects were cylindrical, Rowntree noticed, their description seemed like an assumption. It wasn't obvious that they were phallic or male fertility symbols. Meanwhile, the Venus of Malta display had been labeled by the archaeologists as, quote, a remarkable representation which reflects a high level of artistic achievement in modeling. In particular, the sign continued, the back of this figure reflects a very realistic rendering of anatomical features. Now, Rowntree was surprised by this because the front, she thought, was very realistic with its anatomical features. But the back was the more androgynous part, right? And that front part of her had been inexplicably, but obviously, bypassed. Rowntree also noticed that the Venus of Malta's information panel did not include any mention of the possibility that there was any sacred or symbolic meaning associated with her. In the museum, she's not a goddess or a priestess or even a woman, Rowntree writes, only a fine example of artistic modeling. Nearby, a case of 8 obvious anatomically female figurines with exaggerated features was also described with no reference to their gender. They were just called figurines. Rowntree describes one more display case that contained a number of fragments depicting pubic triangles and some small, crudely worked, obviously female figurines, 3 of which have large bellies and breasts. At least one has 9 lines across her back and is stylized in such a way as to strongly suggest that the figure represents women in a late stage of pregnancy or about to give birth. The museum did not have anything at all to say about that case. That case had no information panel. Rowntree asked herself, if these possibly phallic symbols can be said to be associated with fertility, why not also the figurines with clearly marked features, the full-breasted, pregnant-bellied figures, the sleeping lady, or even the Venus? Why is maleness linked with fertility, but never femaleness, especially when femaleness is so much more evident in the display. In fact, she noted there were no figurines at all clearly depicting male characteristics, suggesting that the ambiguous figurines were also most likely female. Interesting, right? Androcentric bias is what Roundtree called it. Androcentric bias, an emphasis on maleness and a de-emphasis on femaleness. She gives an example of androcentric bias outside of the museum, too. The archaeologist and scholar John Evans, who had written the most comprehensive survey of Malta's archaeological finds, called the pregnant figurines I just mentioned, quote, horribly distorted female forms with a, quote, abdominal tumor. In his 1996 book, he described them as having a, quote, pathological condition. I think he missed something. Last week, I had a wonderful conversation with our congregation's 8th graders about science and morality. We were debating to what degree the practices of science, including peer review, guarantee truth. Now, those 8th graders are going to give their coming-of-age statements next Sunday in worship, and you're not going to want to miss that. The way Malta's Neolithic figurines have been classified, like what's been said and what has not been said about them, both in the museum and in reports outside of it, and the fact that these aren't isolated cases but are actually part of something much more widespread, these facts show us that sometimes, even just in the act of saying what they see, scientists are already speaking from a particular perspective. In the words we choose, in the things that catch our eye, in the questions that we think to ask and the ones we don't think to ask when we are formulating hypotheses, we humans inadvertently project our norms and our prejudices onto the natural and historical world. In The Chalice and the Blade, Ryan Eisler explains how 20th century Western archaeologists, who were overwhelmingly male, interpreted artifacts from the Paleolithic era, which is even older than the Neolithic, so even older than 10,000 years, much older. From that era, we find paintings that were protected by caves or eaves from the wear of time. There are burial grounds and human-formed objects. Burial sites of the Paleolithic era contain bodies surrounded by cowrie shells and red ochre. Cowrie shells are shaped in the form of, as one archaeologist put it, the portal through which a child enters the world. That was delicately put. The female form, which is, of course, associated with birth, is a symbol of life, but it was also associated with death because the ancients understood time to be cyclical, and reincarnation required another birth. When goddess images were discovered, archaeologists assumed that they, along with the burial rites, must have been indications of a matriarchal rather than patriarchal society. But when they couldn't find any evidence that women had dominated men, they returned to thinking that the societies must have been patriarchal after all, and the female figures and images must have been objects representing sexuality or fertility. Archaeologists also found drawings of stick-like objects which they understood to be weapons, and they described painted scenes as hunting rituals, even when they depicted groups of dancing women. But while 20th century archaeologists operated from the preconception that Paleolithic art was done by a stereotypical primitive man, and that hunting and war would have been the major focuses of their lives, closer inspections revealed that some of the fletches on drawings described as weapons actually went in the wrong direction, more like a tree branch than an arrow or a spear. The weapons may have more likely been objects of nature. And this makes sense because while they would have been hunters, people then would also have been gatherers. They had not yet figured out agriculture. That wouldn't happen until the beginning of the Neolithic. There's also evidence of rites to support the fertility of plants and animals. Later artifacts would show human-like goddesses surrounded by symbols of the natural world. Some of the female forms were themselves part animal, suggesting a sense of interconnection or interdependence. Finally, as a leading archaeologist noted, female figurines and symbols were often centrally located in the chambers of ancient buildings, and masculine symbols were usually arranged around the female figures or further out along the sides. So although there's been a tendency to interpret female figurines as secular or sexual rather than sacred, it appears ancient people of Europe and the Near East had a religious worldview centered on the goddess and nature. It makes intuitive sense that humans would have thought of women when imagining the source of creation. New life came from female bodies in their experience. So, were they matriarchal? Well, matriarchal and patriarchal were not the only two options. Instead, some scholars have posited that goddess societies were neither, that there was no system of domination of one group by another, but rather they represent societies organized not around ranking, but around linking. Okay? There are clear artistic and social connections between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic eras, and then later with Old Europe. More goddesses, more nature images, and more evidence that societies may have been organized by linking rather than by ranking. Marija Gimbutas, a 20th century female archaeologist who specialized in the Neolithic and Old Europe eras, noted that despite our perception of ancient Europeans as barbaric invaders, many old European sites appear to have been built for beauty and agriculture, but not with much strategy for defensive value. And they lack remnants of weapons of war. There's also evidence that male dominance was not the norm there. And one piece of evidence is that women's and men's graves appear to be egalitarian, with no significant difference in the wealth or artifacts that were buried with them. In fact, sometimes women's graves contained slightly more artifacts. Later graves were different, though. Later, men's graves had more artifacts than women's, and the artifacts found reveal a clear reverence for weapons. And burials seem to reflect a hierarchy later on, one in which male leaders are buried surrounded by servants, wives, concubines, and children, including some who were sacrificed at the time of the man's death, so that they could be buried with him like possessions. What happened? Right? How did Europe and the Near East move from a possibly goddess-worshiping, egalitarian, relatively peaceful society to hierarchical societies with a reverence for weapons? Eisler describes it as a change so great that nothing else in all we know of human cultural evolution is comparable in magnitude. It's the same event that Dr. Milton Brown described in a lecture here a couple of years ago when he was talking about the history of racism. It's the invasion of a nomadic group called the Kurgans. They were Aryan language speakers and are sometimes referred to as Aryans. And sometimes they're referred to also as Indo-Europeans, which is a reference to the Indus Valley, what's now India, which they invaded before heading west. As they made their way across Europe in 3 migratory waves between 4300 and 2800 BCE, their paths left evidence of widespread violence and destruction, and evidence that as they conquered the people they encountered, they imposed their worldview. Male dominance, the value of might and brute force over creativity, a warlike male god, and an emphasis on war, weapons, and the power to kill or dominate. That Aryan worldview was about power over and not about interdependence. It was focused on death and not on birth. Later, Christianity was used to build on Aryan views. It split the world between good and evil, spirit and matter. And even though Jesus preached a message of love and radical equality, that's not how it played out in the big picture. Christianity saw women as still too close to nature with their monthly cycles, pregnancies, and messy birth processes. God was envisioned to be a man, removed from such things. In the Gospels, Paul tells the Christians, the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, reinforcing male-dominant norms. And soon women were excluded from the priesthood, too. The separation of spirit and matter also devalued life in this world, with the result that oppression was not seen as a justice matter like those Jesus spoke of in the Beatitudes, but as a cross to bear that would be removed in the next life, in heaven. Similarly, the earth was expected to pass away after humankind exerted power over it. The United States was formed out of this history. The dominant culture here reflects that, and it shows. In the 1980s, a movement emerged lifting up this story of the past and calling Americans to move from ranking to linking once more. It became known as the Goddess Movement. Now, in the US, there are already non-dominant cultures that practice linking, and more exist in other parts of the world, too. The Goddess Movement acknowledged this, and by showing that the dominant culture's own heritage also included that wisdom, hoped that linking might grow in influence. The symbols of the two worldviews are on their surface gendered, right? They seem gendered, a female goddess or a male god. But neither is really truly about gender. Both genders participated in each, or participate in each. Ancient goddesses were often depicted with male companions, and today's male god is companioned for many by the Mother Mary or the Virgin of Guadalupe. And the real difference is not gender, but that worldview. It's the difference between ranking and linking. We see that the power over ranking model of being, in which some people have more value than others, and the earth and her creatures are just stuff to be used up, has caused suffering and war. It has estranged us from nature, and it's hurting the planet and all lives which depend on it. On this Earth Day Sunday, with climate change already taking place, and reports of violence around the world, and nuclear weapons ready to go, and everything else, it feels, and it has felt for a long time, like we're headed for a breakdown. But maybe what will happen is a breakthrough, because it can take a lot of chaos to get to transformation. And we are seeing more linking, connections being made between poverty, racism, women's rights, immigration, and the war economy, and other issues. Linking is one of the great strengths of the Poor People's Campaign, which launches on Mother's Day. I'm going to travel to Washington, D.C. that day to join the movement, and we'll be participating here in New Mexico. The whole campaign will take 40 days. That's the days of action this year for the campaign. What I appreciate is the deep sense of caring and connectedness within it. Something, as the poet says, that is more than tolerance, older than kindness, oddly akin to love. May that same spirit lead us in all we do and guide our feet now and in the generations to come.